Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, good day, wherever you are. Whether you are here in this room or watching online, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to this WTO Public Forum. Many of you may be veterans, but this is my very first one as Director General. Today's hybrid format and the strict limits on the number of people authorized to enter the WTO premises reflect the fact that COVID-19 is still very much with us. But we are grateful that we can at least have a hybrid format and be able to see some of you in person. Indeed, in many of our members, the pandemic and its social and economic impacts are getting worse. But even as we fight to end the pandemic, making full use of trade's power to tackle inequity, to tackle vaccine inequity, we must engage in serious thinking about what it would take to build back a better world economy. A world economy that is greener, more prosperous, and more inclusive. A world economy that is more responsive to problems of the global commons. A WTO that is more responsive to the changing economic realities and the evolving needs of the people we serve. That is what this week is all about. Civil society groups, academics, the private sector, WTO members and others have put together 102 sessions covering an incredible spectrum of issues from agriculture to digital trade, climate change, to politics. 5,700 participants have registered to listen, debate, and exchange views. I look forward to listening to all of you. And I also take this opportunity to thank our incredible team that put this whole thing together. Ideas matter for trade policy, but these ideas are ultimately a means to an end. It's about using trade to make people's lives better, creating jobs, expanding opportunities, and promoting sustainability. Let's just take a moment to watch the video that's about to come on about people and trade.
Trade can really connect the world.
Back and forth without borders.
Trade is about people because it connects them.
Trade does affect every single person in the world.
I am nothing without you, and you are nothing without me in trade.
Trade is about people. It's about a woman in Karachi being able to teach a student all the way in Antwerp, Belgium, and there are no borders.
I think trade plays a part in everyday's life. From my point of view, on my business, everyone in the circle is affected. For example, the artisan, the tile makers, the truck drivers, everyone is affected, even the suppliers abroad.
Lorsqu'on achète de chez moi un tapis et que le monsieur qui achète ou la femme qui achète garde pour une vie, ça donnera la publicité, non seulement à mon petit commerce, mais aussi à mon pays. Pour moi, c'est un vrai ambassadeur du Maroc.
Trade is about people because it connects them. We can connect people with the technology and the solutions to then act locally and be resilient with the things they want to do.
Trade is about creating equitable businesses for people. Trade has allowed these consumers here in Canada to taste flavor from Africa, the bridge connecting these two worlds.
We are very much organized around people. In fact, one of our phrases is meaningful connections, and is the connection we have from the weaving family all the way to your family if you're the end buyer of one of our hammocks. And because the hammock are woven, I think this also exemplifies how these connections really happen.
Trade allows us to interact with different people in different cultures. Without business, there is no people, and there is no business that exists in the world that is without people.
Businesses are made by people to people. We have to value the individuality. Everyone is unique, and through their knowledge, skills, and experience, we manage to build together companies with soul. So trade is definitely about people.
Le commerce concerne les personnes.
El comercio es alrededor de gente.
Beim Handel geht es die Menschen.
Comércio é sobre pessoas.
Trade is about people.
I always say trade is about people, so that was music to my ears. For the entrepreneurs in the video, for the businesses they run and the workers they employ, trade has been a lifeline in the pandemic. Mahin Adumji leads what used to be an in-person tutoring business in Pakistan. When lockdowns prevented students from attending classes, she took the business online. A year and a half later, her instructors don't teach math. They don't just teach math, Urdu, and coding to the same students who used to come to their homes for lessons in cities around Pakistan. They reach students in the US, Europe, Canada, the UAE, and elsewhere, as we heard her say in the video. 30% of the company's customer base is now international. For Fahia Jama, a serial entrepreneur in Nairobi, going online helped her business training company connect to new clients at home and in 6 other African countries. Josefina Ozais was forced to close her hammock business's physical store in Mexico, but strengthening her online presence helped her find new customers abroad and maintain livelihoods for hundreds of traditional weavers in the Yucatan Peninsula. If you want to hear more about Mahin, Fahia, and Josefina, and to learn about how global trade rules affect companies like theirs, you can check out the WTO's new podcast series called Let's Talk Trade. What was true for their businesses has been true for the world economy overall. In the pandemic, trade has been a source of resilience, helping households, businesses, and governments cope with dramatic shocks. Trade has enabled access to food and medical supplies and contributed to economic recovery. Restraint in the use of protectionism allowed fiscal and monetary stimulus to drive a sharp rebound in global trade, starting in the middle of last year. Global merchandise trade is back at record levels, though services is recovering more slowly. Even as the value of global merchandise trade fell by 7.6% in 2020, agriculture trade held stable, and the value of trade in medical products rose by 16%. Trade in personal protective equipment grew by nearly 50% and by 480% for textile face cover masks. As scientists developed COVID-19 vaccines at record speeds, multi-country supply chains came together to provide the specialized inputs and capital goods needed for vaccine production at scale. Most leading COVID-19 vaccines rely on inputs from a dozen or more countries. The WTO's forthcoming World Trade Report looks at trade and resilience in greater detail. It finds that our hyper-connected global economy has made us more vulnerable to shocks, international transport disruptions, supply chain cutoffs, and of course, pandemics. At the same time, it finds that our links have made us more resilient to shocks when they do strike. When domestic supplies are in crisis, we can import. When we are hit with the worst pandemic in a century, scientists from around the world can share ideas and technology and develop safe and effective vaccines at record speed. Let us be clear that the picture is not all rosy. The rebound in growth and trade is unequal across countries and regions, as is access to COVID-19 vaccines. 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty, mostly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. While nearly 60% of people in developed countries are fully vaccinated, in Africa the figure is barely 4%. This is devastating for the lives and livelihoods of Africans. It is morally unacceptable, and as new variants spread, a threat to the health and economic recovery everywhere. The trading system can and must do more to reduce vaccine inequity and to help us tackle pressing challenges elsewhere, from our oceans to our climate. That is why it is so important to deliver results at the WTO in the weeks remaining before our 12th Ministerial Conference. To remind all of us what is at stake, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, President Cyril Ramaphosa of the Republic of South Africa. Before taking office, President Ramaphosa was a leader in the anti-apartheid struggle, in the trade union movement, and in the democratic South Africa's business sector. President Ramaphosa has been singularly instrumental as President of the African Union in Africa's strong response to the pandemic. He has forged a One Africa response along with other leaders, helping to create the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, AVAT, the African Vaccine Manufacturers Task Force, as well as supporting the Africa CDC. President Ramaphosa has actively pursued investment in Africa's manufacturing capacity, whilst also strongly advocating for an IP waiver. His efforts and our modest support behind the scenes led Pfizer-BioNTech to announce an investment in BioVac, a South African company aimed at producing 100 million COVID-19 vaccine doses each year. Let me now hand over to His Excellency, my brother, President Cyril Ramaphosa. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies and heads of international organizations, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to thank you, my sister, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, for the honor of addressing this important event. We were overjoyed when we were finally installed as head of the WTO, and we can already see the benefits of having done so, because your own perspective is global and your interest is to advance the ordinary people of our world. The WTO Public Forum is a unique opportunity to hear a broad range of global voices on trade, development, and human progress. This is a particularly valuable platform as the global community confronts the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating effect it has had on lives, on health, on livelihoods, and on society more generally. As we consider the WTO response to the pandemic, I am reminded of President Nelson Mandela's address on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In his remarks, President Mandela called for a WTO that recognizes the frustrations of ordinary people. He emphasized the importance of trade rules and that they should be fair. He said that special consideration must be given to developing economies and that the WTO should contribute to changing rather than defending the existing patterns of production. Importantly, President Mandela called for WTO members to forge a partnership for development through trade and investment. His message is as relevant today as it was at the time he made his statement. The world is at this moment experiencing the debilitating effects of inequality in the patterns of global production. While human ingenuity has produced several effective and safe COVID-19 vaccines, human inertia and human self-centeredness has severely limited access to these vaccines to many people around the world. Our inability to act on the call by President Mandela to change patterns of production has cost the world millions of lives and has undoubtedly extended the duration of the pandemic. It is said that less than 3% of adults are fully vaccinated in most low-income countries, compared to almost 60% in high-income countries. This gross inequality is both unjust and counterproductive. The longer it takes to vaccinate the world's population, the greater the loss of life, the likelier the emergence of new variants, and the longer it will take to achieve sufficient population immunity. The rapid and equitable rollout of life-saving medical products is the best response to the virus and the best stimulus plan for a strong, sustained, and economic recovery. The WTO has a central role in addressing trade and intellectual property-related barriers to boost and diversify production of vaccines, diagnostics, as well as therapeutics. Passing a time-bound, targeted TRIPS waiver, as proposed by South Africa and India, and now supported by many countries around the world, is urgent if we are to save millions of lives. This is a proportionate response to the exceptional circumstances presented by COVID-19 pandemic. Unequal access to vaccines presents a huge risk to a sustained global recovery. The Economist Intelligence Unit estimates that vaccine inequality will come at a cost of some $2.3 trillion to global GDP between 2022 and 2025. We therefore need to reaffirm the principle of global solidarity and the role of open and inclusive multilateralism. While there has been some recovery in international trade since the start of the pandemic, it has been uneven. Relatively positive short-term outlook for global trade is marred by regional disparities, continued weakness in services trade, and lagging vaccine timetables, particularly in poor countries. According to the World Bank, global growth is expected to accelerate to 5.6% this year, with only two major economies accounting for a quarter of this growth. However, in low-income economies, where vaccination has been slow, growth projections have been revised lower to 2.9%. As a consequence, the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda has been severely set back by many years. We are not as yet building back better, as we often hear it being said, nor are we building back together. With the lives and livelihoods of billions of people across the world at risk, the opportunity for a coordinated response must not be squandered. As we move towards the 12th Ministerial Conference, we must urgently take bold steps to expand and diversify locations of production to enable all countries to obtain life-saving medical products and technologies. This is not the time just to be unidimensionally focused on just profit. This is the time to save lives. The aspirations of the Marrakesh Agreement should be at the center of our actions towards a post-COVID-19 economic recovery. We need to recognize that trade is not an end in itself, but it is a means of raising standards of living, creating employment, as well as improving people's lives. This means that we must ensure that developing economies, and especially the least developed among them, secure a share in the growth in international trade that is commensurate with the needs of their economic development. Now more than ever before, we need a multilateral trading system that promotes inclusive economic growth and development, with the World Trade Organization at its core and leading the process. The reform of trade-distorting domestic support in agriculture is a long-standing agenda that has become more urgent in the context of COVID-19. UN agencies report that global farm subsidies have reached the levels of $540 billion a year. Without reform, the level of agriculture subsidies could rise to $2 trillion a year by 2030. These subsidies affect the competitiveness of agriculture, especially in developing economies, with damaging consequences for food security, livelihoods, and local production. We must address the asymmetries in existing WTO agreements that perpetuate trade patterns which confine developing economies to the lower end of the global value chains. We need trade rules that create more opportunities for structural transformation and industrialization in developing economies. This is particularly important for African countries, which need to increase their rates of industrialization. The WTO and the global community will need to consider special measures to boost and support these efforts. We must build on inclusive digital economy in which approaches to technology transfer are mutually beneficial, and the benefits of digital industrialization and management of data flows are equally felt across the world. Importantly, measures taken to address climate change must be effective and show strong ambition. They must enable developing countries to address the industrialization gap and must conform to our WTO commitments. We need to ensure that they are not disguised forms of protection. Our success in combating climate change will require that concessional funding is made available to support a just transition in developing economies, a just transition that is still dealing with the challenges of job creation, poverty alleviation, and inclusive growth. We are aware that the support being provided to firms, income and employment at this time will elevate sovereign and corporate debt levels. We need to work together to ensure that this debt does not threaten a sustainable broad-based economic recovery. The WTO's trade and debt work and collaboration with the IMF and the World Bank is critical. In this work, and indeed in all areas of trade, we must recognize that the WTO is made up of countries that are at different levels of economic development. We need an effective multilateral trading system that cultivates an appropriate balance between national development strategies and multilateral cooperation. We believe that the WTO is capable of finding negotiated solutions that are balanced and address the interests of all. Such agreement on issues like the TRIPS waiver is both possible and necessary if the WTO is to live up to the expectations of ordinary people, of which President Mandela spoke. The current global pandemic has presented the world with one of its greatest health, social, and economic challenges in more than a century. Through collaboration, unity, solidarity, and mutual respect, through bodies like the WTO, we can rise to these challenges. And let us build a fairer, more prosperous, and more resilient world. This, as Nelson Mandela would have said, is in our hands. And right now, as he also said at one occasion, it may seem impossible until it is done. It is eminently doable, and I think we can do it. And I thank you, my dearest sister. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those very wise words that you've said to us. It's an honor for us to be able to host you, even if it's virtually. We would have loved to have you here in person, perhaps next time. Thank you. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to our moderator, Bloomberg's Haslinda Amin, who is far more competent than me to run the occasion. Thank you.
Dr. Ngozi, thank you so much for that. Hello, hola, salam, ni hao. I'm Haslinda Amin. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I hope you're well. The pandemic has jolted the global trading system, leaving businesses to grapple with supply chains, labor shortages, huge demand. The ripple effects are being felt from Nairobi to Ningbo. Companies, consumers can expect to face rising costs and delays through next year. But more than that, it's deepened inequality within and between countries. Those with little or no access to vaccines will suffer the biggest blow. Already, the ILO is warning of massive unemployment, a shortage of 75 million jobs this year, 23 million in 2022. So, as we look to recover, how do we reboot the multilateral trading system to ensure better resilience to future shocks? How do we build back better, sustainably, and without leaving anyone behind? Well, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers with us today. Gabriela Busha, Executive Director of Oxfam International, which fights inequality to end poverty and injustice. Gabriela is deeply committed to gender equality, human rights, and to tackling economic inequality. Dr. Tedros Adhanom, Director General of the WHO, the first elected from among multiple candidates. Dr. Tedros is also the first African to head the world's leading public health agency. We also have with us Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. Rebecca was appointed on 13 September 2021. So Rebecca, congratulations for that. She's the first woman to hold this position in the history of the organization. Dr. Sik Porting, Chief Operating Officer of BioNTech. He joined the company in 2014 from Novartis. Dr. Porting started his career as a consultant with McKinsey and Company. And last but not least, Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, Vice Chair, UN Global Compact. Paul is working with business to accelerate action to tackle climate change and inequality. He's a leading proponent that business should be a force for good. Now, before we begin, just a small reminder for the Q&A session in about 30 minutes from now. Please do submit them via the public forum platform using the Q&A function. That's a public forum Q&A function. And if you're watching us on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, send us your questions using the hashtag ASK, that's ask, ASKPF21. Make sure that you include your name, where you're from, i.e. organization. Our team is monitoring all channels. Don't be concerned. They'll be sending me your questions. Dr. Tedros, let's start with you. The WHO has called for a legal binding instrument, one that provides a framework for a more coherent, more coordinated response for future pandemics. Also one that galvanizes engagement, ownership of all countries. These are currently under discussions at the WTO, the importance of a multilateral response on trade as well as health. In your view, what steps do you think should be taken with respect to trade to help us respond better to this as well as future crises?
Thank you. Thank you, Aslinda. And thank you to my sister Ngozi for bringing us all together, and also to His Excellency President Ramaphosa for his leadership. I fully agree with what she said, so I don't want to repeat. And I would also like to congratulate Ngozi for being named one of the Times most influential leaders for 2021. It's well deserved. We're proud of you, Ngozi. We need strong leadership now more than ever. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the fragility of global supply chains. While many countries across the globe have implemented unprecedented travel-related measures, while some of these measures may have delayed importation of the COVID-19 virus, they have also come at a high social and economic cost, exacerbating pre-existing inequities. At the same time, they have often hampered the ability of emergency and humanitarian missions and the transport of essential supplies, including vital components for manufacturing vaccines. This year, we have heard many pledges from the G7, G20, and others on reducing unnecessary trade barriers and improving access to vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. But we're still failing far short of what's needed. In June, Ngozi and I joined forces with the heads of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group to make an extraordinary call to government leaders to start addressing these issues with $50 billion roadmap for health, trade, and finance. This means boosting manufacturing capacity, supply, trade flows, and the equitable distribution of diagnostics, oxygen, treatments, medical supplies, and vaccines. An uninterrupted supply chain to move vaccines from manufacturing to delivery is vital. But right now, there are many gaps and blockages along the way. Right now, 2.4 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines are needed to vaccinate the world's most at-risk people, like health workers, the elderly, those with underlying conditions, and other vulnerable groups. The vaccines exist, but they are still not reaching the people who need them most. This year, Member states at the World Health Assembly called for delinking travel from trade restrictions during public health emergencies of international concern, with the goal of maximizing the effectiveness of public health measures while minimizing their negative economic impacts. This includes facilitating the manufacture and movement of critical medical supplies. An example of the kind of coordination that's needed during emergencies is the end-to-end supply chain system. WHO co-lead with the World Food Programme along with UNICEF and other partners, including in the private sector, to address the urgent supply gaps we faced in the early days of COVID-19. And together we procured and shipped more than $1.4 billion of essential response supplies, including vital medical oxygen, personal protective equipment, and more than 250 million COVID-19 tests to 193 countries. Investing in multi-sectoral public health supply chains for essential goods can help ensure emergency preparedness, robust response, and affordable access to global medical supplies and equipment. In closing, let me leave you with three priorities. First, we need to remove unnecessary trade and travel constraints so that we can make vaccines and other vital available tools to those most in need. Second, we need to support the capacities of all countries to roll out COVID-19 vaccines. And finally, WHO looks forward to continuing collaboration with the World Trade Organization and all member states to lower the barriers to trade and travel during health emergencies. Haslinda, thank you so much again, and back to you.
Dr. Tedros, I know you have to leave us. If I could just follow up with a few questions. I'd like to take a look at the role of the WHO. How do you think the WHO needs to change to be more effective going forward for future pandemics as well as future global health crises? What's paramount, you think?
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe if I can tell you, I mean, first of all, we have to learn from this pandemic. It's unprecedented, and we need to learn honestly. And second, after the learning process, of course, we're learning, we need to put all the interventions we need. And we, as you know, we had a panel, the panel had recommendations, and we have other panels who gave recommendations, and we need to implement those recommendations. I cannot go into details, but I will mention one, the pandemic treaty or agreement that can pull all the recommendations together and address them in a holistic approach through binding, rules that can address all the problems I have been outlining now. If we have a pandemic treaty, for instance, it can address the problem of sharing data or sharing information that we're facing now. Sharing of technology, we're facing the same problem now. Sharing of biological material that we're facing now. And there is a problem in the early warning system, and that can be addressed by having some binding rules in that, obliges countries to be as transparent as possible. So I think the pandemic treaty can really address the major challenges we have now and prepare us for the future in a better way. But that's one among other things. Although I take that as one of the central, recommendations that needs to be addressed as soon as possible, and the world should agree to have a framework to push, including, by the way, the banning exports and refusing even to transfer technologies and the IP. All that I think should be governed by a treaty that the world agrees in order to address them in the future. But we're facing the same problems again and again because we don't have any rule that really guides all these problems or to address those problems.
To put an end to the pandemic as well, Dr. Tedros, we need to understand the virus origins. What's your current view on the virus origins? Where do you need to go next?
Yes, as you know, we had a very good study, phase 1, although there are challenges also, as I said earlier. and we need to address those challenges. I have said it many times in the past, and move on to the second phase. We have already started a very open and transparent mechanism with our member states, and I hope the second phase will start as soon as possible. Knowing the origin of the virus is very, very important, because it's through knowing the origin or what happened that we can prevent the next one. So we expect the collaboration of China and all countries involved. Thank you so much.
Dr. Tedros, thank you so much for your time today. Now, I'd like to pose the next question to Rebecca. Rebecca, as head of an organization supporting developing countries to access benefits of a globalized economy, what do you think organizations like the WTO, like UNCTAD, can do to assist poorer nations to build resilience against this and future crises? More specifically, how can trade policies help us prepare more effectively for future pandemics?
Thank you very much, Linda, and let me also greet and thank Ngozi for inviting all of us and for this public forum. Let me first say that the pandemic demonstrated how important the rules of trade and trade itself is to cope with the challenges of a crisis, and how its disruption can hurt countries and people. So the first thing in which we can help, and I join other voices before me saying this, is having a trade policy with rules that govern trade that are stable and respected. Because if that doesn't happen, so countries cannot rely on international trade for imports and exports. So trade can be a very positive force, but we need to believe that the rules are stable, are respected. And what we saw in the pandemic, as was said before, is that we saw an increase on export restrictions and non-tariff measures. President Ramaphosa called it disguised forms of protectionism. So we saw a lot of them. And let me, for example, tell you that a study from UNCTAD tells us that the non-tariff measures hurt poor countries and least developed countries. 14% of their exports was lost in least developed countries because of non-tariff measures. And for them, even to show compliance with those non-tariff measures is really impossible. So we really have to think, and Ngozi spoke about the global trade rules that, according to President Ramaphosa, as he said, must be fair and give more opportunities for developing countries in their struggle to development and diversification. This is my first point. We should have stable and respected rules that are also fair for trade to be able to be a very positive force for development and for sustainable development. That's my first point. My second point is that regional integration can help a lot. And we should support the regional schemes that are being put forward, that exist, and the ones that are being built, like the African Free Trade Zone. And regional integration and regional policies have proven to be more resilient when we are in front of a crisis like we have had. Regional integration can help to harmonize regimes within a region and has proven to be effective and more resilient when a crisis hits us. And also, I would say to round this intervention, how important is to understand that if trade is about people, So it is about development. It's not an objective, a goal in itself. It has to be trade and development. And we need to really support countries in their struggle for development, so trade can be a force for inclusion and for sustainability.
Pick up on some of those issues slightly later. Right now, I'd like to bring in Dr. Poting of BioNTech. Dr. Poting, BioNTech has partnered with others like Pfizer to scale up vaccine production. We're seeing that access to vaccines has been much faster and easier for developed countries compared to poorer nations. Many developing countries believe that intellectual property is part of the problem. What is your view on this?
Yeah, so I think what we are seeing is really what you refer to is that the distribution is where it's produced right now, and yes, we do believe that the solution to this is building up sustainable manufacturing capabilities, and with that, I mean local production manufacturing capabilities, and with that we have the chance actually to democratize the access to health together as a public-private effort, actually. So what this means, actually, we have to enable dedicated regions to have access to the know-how and ensure that those regions actually have everything in place to manufacture their own vaccines. So now, how did we work through the pandemic to actually start on this journey? So number one is with the Pfizer, in the Pfizer-BioNTech alliance, we sat down and said, like, we have to produce as much as possible from the start. So while we were still developing the vaccine, we built up production facilities and started on partners to do tech transfer to as many partners as possible. And we are still increasing these partnerships right now. So that means in the short term, in terms of availability of vaccines. So I mean, there are several tens of million doses to low and middle income countries via COVAX, but also Pfizer and BioNTech committed like 2 billion doses within the next 1.5 years to low and middle income countries, 1 billion within this year, which is like a third of the Pfizer-BioNTech production capacity this year. So one prong approach is like maximize the global facilities that we have as much as possible. And we set out with like in our home countries, because that was the most accessible at this time, the US and in Europe, in Belgium and in Germany, that's where our big production hubs are, and which we'll max out in order to produce as much vaccines as possible. So in the midterm, and which we're working on already, is like get more and more of single production steps, because they're really outrageously complicated actually to transfer to other countries, like for example, the BioVac partnership in South Africa. Midterm, actually, because it's needed midterm in the pandemic, it also means bring end-to-end production to those countries. So basically, there are a couple of stakeholders, many important stakeholders like the WHO and European Union that are actually supporting that. So basically, with our company, as a young company with idealistic founders and idealistic employees, we really try to support this end-to-end local production. So we have like 15 partners as a BioNTech already, plus Pfizer, plus the Pfizer network. So that's like 3 billion doses in 2022 that will be produced, and way more than 3 billion 3 billion in 2021, and way more than 3 billion in 2022, actually. So that ensures a safe and effective vaccine, actually. So now, in order to get this localized, you really have to go piece by piece. So even fill and finish is extremely important and difficult, because you have to fill and store the material at -70 degrees. So nothing is really easy in this process. So the process itself has like 50,000 production steps, highly specialized production facilities, which we can check transfer to local countries. So basically, as I mentioned before, the BioVac is the first step. So we have another partner with Europharma in Latin America, together with Pfizer, where we'll start production steps. But also there is a broader attempt to like bring mRNA really to the countries. And I think we announced last month that we are evaluating the establishment of sustainable vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Rwanda and Senegal as soon as possible to support vaccine supply for the member states of the African Union. So with that, to summarize, I mean, there's this approach to max out our capacities that we have right now, but also start bringing the technology into the countries, which is not an easy task because you have to manage supply chains, you have to manage the equipment, and you have to manage and show the local production teams actually how this is done. So this is an endeavor that has started and that will continue with the highest urgency actually in our company.
Dr. Pudding, you say manufacture as soon as possible, but soon may not be soon enough. There is a cost to it. I mean, why not have this waiver? There's a case for it.
Well, we built up the network as soon as possible, and this as soon as possible meant that we brought up lipid supply chain, for example. So there were no manufacturers of lipids, so we had to teach them how to do this. We had to insource the technology. We had to do various tech transfers. We are still the tech transfer partners. Our contract manufacturing organizations in Europe that we brought on board actually end of last year already, they are still ramping up with their capacity and there is still ongoing tech transfer. So this is not an easy task actually to teach the various teams actually to with the same safety and process preciseness to teach how this is done actually. So that's why there is the urge of bringing this technology to the countries, but you have to teach everyone how to really do it. It's a new technology. It's nothing that has been around for a while. And there are a few experts. We are training more and more teams to do tech transfers, but you have to supervise that process to really make it efficient in the countries. And that's why we started with like the BioVac and the Europharma for fill and finish, while at the same time we are working on solutions how to bring the manufacturing in a better way to Africa and develop training programs to do this in the world.
Thank you for that, Dr. Pudding. I want to bring in Gabriella into the conversation. Gabriella, we know that in addition to the millions of lives lost, the pandemic has caused major socio-economic disruption. The World Bank estimates that more than 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty. Inequality has deepened, the gender rate or gender gap has widened, unemployment, the rates have gone up. Oxfam has been for a very long time a constructive voice in advocating for trade rules that reduce poverty. What role do you think trade can play in promoting an inclusive recovery?
Thanks, Haslinda. A huge thanks to you, Dr. Ngozi, and the WTO for welcoming Oxfam and the People's Vaccine Alliance today. And Haslinda, panelists, as Dr. Ngozi said at the beginning, trade is about people's lives, and fair trade rules are needed for an inclusive recovery. But I would like to be upfront with us today that the pandemic is exposing this harsh inequality in unjust global trade rules. And the consequence of this is not academic. Of the 6 billion COVID-19 vaccines delivered globally, less than 1% have gone to low-income nations, and 7 people are dying each minute. Too many people are dying who could have been saved by a vaccine. And this is personal to each one of us. And to me, seeing how many died in my country, Colombia, over recent months, who could still be with us. And Latin America accounts for 31% of all COVID deaths, despite making up 8% of the global population. So a year ago, the biggest barrier to defeating the deadly virus was science. And thanks to over $100 billion of public investment and the work of brilliant scientists, humanity created safe and effective vaccines. So today, science isn't the biggest barrier to defeating the virus, but it is vaccine monopolies, and it is unjust trade rules that protect those monopolies. So let's be very clear. Yes, we need to unblock those bottlenecks in supply chains, and yes, we need to lift unnecessary and unjust export restrictions. But export restrictions and supply bottlenecks don't explain why BioNTech and Pfizer had delivered 9 times more vaccines to Sweden than to all low-income countries combined. And they don't explain why 80% of the world's vaccines so far have been delivered to just 10 countries. So the reality is that current trade rules enable rich country governments and pharmaceutical corporations to work hand in hand to artificially restrict vaccine supplies for developing countries. And this needs to change. So the impact of extreme vaccine inequity and unjust trade rules is killing people. And the impact is potential new variants that could be deadlier. So it is millions more pushed into poverty, girls pushed out of school. It's delaying that economic recovery and that inclusive recovery that we want. The global economy stands to lose $2.3 trillion, crippling developing countries further and emerging markets most of all, and widening the already very large gaps. So my message today is that relying on the benevolence and charity of rich nations and pharma hasn't delivered to the level that we need. So it's time to suspend monopolies and share the vaccine blueprints so we can bring prices down and crucially grant developing countries the ability to make more vaccines. And Dr. Tedros, thank you for providing the leadership the world needs, but also for providing practical means. So the World Health Organization has set up the mechanisms in place to transfer vaccine technologies with qualified producers. These can ensure quality control, that is so important. This can provide strong regulatory oversight. And these mechanisms can save literally millions of lives. Yet, not one pharma company has joined. So I end with 3 practical points. First, we need a wide and comprehensive WTO TRIPS waiver on all COVID-19 vaccines and technologies. That is vital to ramping up redistribution and redistributing global supply. Rich countries such as Germany and the UK must drop their opposition to this life-saving proposal. Second, the WTO must do everything in its power to deliver the waiver this year. We need the WTO to succeed and rise to the challenge. We need to waive IP this pandemic and be prepared to do so in future crises. And finally, Cirque, it's an incredible achievement that BioNTech developed an extraordinary life-saving vaccine with public help. Yet it saddens me and many of us that billions of people cannot access it. I must appeal to BioNTech. The vaccine has turned your CEO into a double-digit billionaire. Based on estimates by mRNA experts at Imperial College London, BioNTech are charging 24 times the estimated cost of production. Even then, transferring tech and a waiver will still compensate BioNTech fairly. So let me ask directly, Cirque, will BioNTech share this life-saving technology widely? Can you do it through the World Health Organization mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub in South Africa? That act would be the right thing to do, and it would save millions of lives. Thank you.
The numbers are tragic, Gabriella. I want to bring in Paul Polman. Paul, when we think about building back better, what role does trade have in promoting a green recovery? More specifically, how can businesses, especially the small ones in poorer nations, be encouraged, be empowered to become more sustainable and respond better to social challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Linda, once more, and also thanks for Ngozi to include us and have this debate at this crucial time. It's very clear to me that in this age of populism that we live in, we must not allow the trade liberalization to become the lightning rod of the perceived shortcomings of globalization. If world leaders really do believe in building back better, as the president of South Africa was just saying, then the trade agenda needs to be fully integrated in their plans. And that also requires a change of narrative. Trade, as we've heard, should solve the poverty, not create poverty. It should solve the crisis of climate change, not cause more CO2 emission. It should help the equitable distribution of vaccines or food even, or other essential goods. It's not only vaccines, instead of hinder it. And it starts with trust, if I may say, because it's very clear right now in many of the things that we are involved in, that the trust is broken. When it comes to the 100 billion of climate financing, we cannot bring it to the table to help the emerging markets. When it comes to vaccine distribution, as we have said, we can't even muster the courage to give everybody fair access. At the International Chamber of Commerce, we calculated that disruptions and mutations that might come as a result of this could not only cost the global economy the $2.3 trillion that the president quoted, but that the cost could be as high as $9 trillion. What is absolutely sickening, to be honest, is that in many of these inabilities of us to act together like global citizens, we are willing to incur costs that are infinitely higher in terms of the problems we have to deal with,
than what it would cost us to find the solutions in the first place. So making these vaccines available very fast to everybody in this world is not just a moral obligation. It just makes a lot of economic sense for anybody that understands that. One of the suggestions here might be to have governments and international organizations that are listening, the WTO, the WHO, really look at how we can build this more resilient and efficient supply chain by looking at what has been done on the agricultural market information system. We could create something of an equivalent magnitude as a health market information system, using the available data, machine learning, the digital tools that we have. A lot more is possible to help identify quicker these bottlenecks and bring these vaccines and medical equipment and whatever you have to the right places very fast. And obviously, the second thing, which I totally agree with Gabrielle, is to be true that we have to treat this as a public good, not for some to enrich themselves at the expense of too many others. It just doesn't work anymore. And frankly, if we can invent a vaccine in 9 months' time at a global level, we should not have to defend why we cannot build these production facilities in these emerging markets and have these temporary waivers on IP either. I thought that we at least should have the courage or the morality to put humanity ahead of simple profits, to be honest. Now, what business needs to accelerate the global agenda? I would say in simple words, and for the interest of time, it's really all about incentives. There's some good work going on the WTO and certainly has been re-energized. For example, the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions are really helpful and go in the right direction. But if we want a green recovery for everybody, we need to align government policies to support these market shifts. In many areas, we still see per subsidies on fossil or on agriculture or on fishery. And in this case, the fishery reforms that are being discussed at the ministerial conference should actually or hopefully be a significant step forward if you can come with solutions. We also need to redirect state aid and give it to more responsible industries. Actually, in Building Back Better, the president again was once more right. We're not doing that if we see where the money goes. It should go to renewable energy, to regenerative agriculture. That's the future we want. And then, last but not least, we should set the rules for the market to deliver this wealth that we want. We have the general agreement on trade and services, for example, that needs to be upgraded, reducing the trade barriers to e-commerce and helping the poorer nations access the aid and the digital tools and technologies to be competitive. In fact, Ngozi, in her wonderful film in the beginning, was referring to how it helped many to actually stay alive. We also need to ensure that we have more market access to green technology. It's not only the vaccines, but we need to lower the trade barriers on environmental goods and services and open these markets to give every country the opportunity to quickly implement it. So, carbon border adjustments to level the playing field in this respect is equally important. So I think we, in a very simple way, need to deal with the trade barriers for the SMEs at the same way as providing the macro structure I just laid out for the global economy. Even the small and medium-sized enterprises can benefit for that. But if you look at the small and medium-sized enterprises specifically, I think it brings you pretty quickly to food. Half the world's population is in food, in agriculture, 1.3 billion people. 60% are self-employed and very poor, actually. They live on $2 a day. And frankly, many of them are involved in the supply chains that are global, like coffee and cocoa, but hardly get any value coming out of that. And part of that is, as the president referred to, the agricultural subsidies that need to be reformed. They're absolutely perverse. In fact, over 500 billion of these subsidies work completely against these countries, protecting the wealthier nations. The European cap policy, a great example of that. We also need to get global standards and transparency to ensure that human rights are respected, that sustainable standards are implemented. We now have a big part of the food industry, for example, agreeing on that and actually wanting to move aggressively to things like regenerative agriculture. But now we need the governments of this world to step up. And I'm actually happy as we go into the COP26 in Glasgow that we've been able to finally put some of these things on the agenda, because it's not only the WTO that we should look for all these answers, but it's more in the overall global cooperation at the G20, the COP15, the COP26, to support organizations like the WTO to cement this into policy.
Paul, I want to pick up on the issue of technology and bring in Rebecca. It is about leveraging technology to build resilience, accelerate the recovery. Rebecca, technology and innovation can help developing countries in particular to integrate into the global supply chain. Technology can also help countries respond better to future pandemics. Where are we in this digital divide? Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges?
This is for Rebecca, no?
Yes, it is for Rebecca. I'm just trying to see if Rebecca is still with us, or it looks like Rebecca has left us. I think she needs to catch a flight. Gabriela, let's come to you. A lot also has to do with the inability of developing nations to properly participate and influence negotiations. What systemic change do you think can bring about a fairer world as we build back better? Gabriela?
I may mute, sorry. I think it starts with a vision, and the president of South Africa, quoting Mandela, said, it looks impossible until it is done. And I think the point is, and it has been said by my predecessors on the panel, what rules should need to be in place to make sure that trade is fair and has an impact and benefits people's lives and is really transformative. And at the moment, the biggest barrier is vaccine inequity and the lack of access. And we can't continue to have solutions that are business as usual when the world is on its knees in terms of the health, the deaths that we are experiencing, but also the huge economic disruption. So every day that passes, countries are falling behind, and the gaps of inequality are widening. They're widening also within countries, and this is unsustainable. So we really need to put our heads together, and the solutions exist. We have experience from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, when for years it was said it wasn't possible to transfer technology, but it took, unfortunately, more than 10 million deaths to finally come together and agree that generics could be produced at scale and at much more affordable prices. And that changed the face of that pandemic that we now are able to handle in the world. So the same with this COVID-19. We cannot wait and poor countries at the end of the queue while their economies are crumbling and while people are dying.
Dr. Poding, there's a question here. We talked earlier about aligning the stakeholders. There's a question from Mahesh Sugathan. He says, could the global community, governments, and the private sector agree on a time-bound target to set up vaccine manufacturing hubs in every continent and put in place the infrastructure, the skills, the training required so we are ready to respond to future health crises? Your thoughts on that?
Linda, thank you. And thank you for the question. So I think this is exactly what needs to be done. So basically, we have to transfer technology into the countries, number one. And to Gabriela's point earlier, I mean, we committed to co-locate our Senegal and Rwanda, respectively South Africa, local manufacturing co-located with the WHO transfer hubs. And that's exactly when the technology meets the local team. So basically, if you bring the technology there, let's call it prepackaged or stably designed, that you can transfer it, and then you have a team and that can teach the team on site. So if you have a hub that is receptive of that with local teams that can then take over while learning how to operate this new process, I think that's how it could and should work. And that's what you can do in every continent. I mean, in Europe, it's easier. In Africa, you have to define the infrastructure and so on, but it will eventually work. And that's what we are working on. So we do have the duty and feel the duty and the task to produce as much as possible right now. But as BioNTech, we also feel the duty to bring local manufacturing to, for example, an Africa. And that's it's eventually it's engineering and a real plan, aligning the stakeholders, how you get the transfer done on a local level, that it really works, that you have a machine that spits out vaccines.
Dr. Potting, just one follow-up question from a participant via Twitter, Shaila Gupta. She wants to know, if BioNTech is expanding its partnership to enhance production, then why not join the WHO Tech Transfer Hub? I think that is a fair question.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, we will co-locate with the WHO Tech Transfer Hub. So basically, that leaves us with the technology that gives us the shortest time to delivery. So if we do this, if you reinvent the technology by just having the recipe, that doesn't help. You really need the teams, and basically what we are building now is we are engineering a process that is stable, that you can replicate it, with the engineers that know the process and have done the process. So, and once you have that, you can, as I said, co-locate it with the WHO transfer hubs, and then you have the best of both worlds. You have the technology, the equipment, and the process there, and you have the local attachment to a local host facility that can run fill and finish, for example, that has the local teams, and then they can take over the process. So that's why I said before, this is the first step with Europharma, where there's a fill and finish process. There's BioVac in South Africa. While they were working on tech transferring the fill and finish process, we are working on a resilient and stable technology to transfer to the countries.
Gabriella, there's a question here from Lewis Miller from the platform. He says, COVID-19 has shown that a global pandemic can have a significant impact upon global energy prices. Europe is facing an energy crisis. OPEC appears to be struggling to meet production quotas. Energy prices impact every aspect of society, from transport to production to home heating. Energy supply is an integral component of world trade. What can the WTO do to safeguard world trade from increasing energy prices? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think this is an area in which we work directly. I think what it points to is the interconnectedness of everything, and how the pandemic is affecting every aspect of our lives, and especially the lives of those most deprived. And as was said earlier, in reality, the fact that the food chains have been affected, and those at the end of the food supply chains are in many cases, unfortunately, not accessing. So again, the issue is the interconnectedness, and how the World Trade Organization and all of us together can help bring solutions to these issues that need collaboration. And maybe linking to Dr. Potting's responses, I think it's very commendable that BioNTech is doing these efforts. I think the intention with the World Health Organization and all of us who are advocating for this is for companies to come together and collaborate and make these steps a lot faster, because every moment that we waste on that time affects too much. Too many people are waiting for the solutions.
Paul, earlier you talked about COP26. As we head to COP26, there are growing calls for countries and companies to be bolder, more courageous in setting their targets. What would you like to see? Are companies really taking action beyond verbal commitment, supporting real systems change? Paul, I think you're on mute.
I apologize. The size of the issue is bigger than companies alone can address. We look at the submission of 113 countries into the Glasgow, what is called the Nationally Determined Commitments, or NDCs, and we find that in the next 10 years, between now and 2030, the emissions are actually going up by 16%, as the IPCC has reported on, whilst we need a 45% reduction. We're on the trajectory to 2.7 degrees global warming, well above the 1.5 that we've set in Paris, in the Paris Agreement. Collectively, the private sector, I think, is starting to move. We've seen about 20% of the private sector making agreements in line with the Paris agreements in terms of decarbonizing their value chain. Far less, unfortunately, still making concrete agreements between now and 2030. But increasingly, alliances are being formed in the financial markets, in the high abatement industries, where we see leaders stepping up and showing that it is possible. And not only possible, that it actually leads to a better economy, more economic growth, better job creation. I think that case is now broadly made. So what we need from Glasgow is very simple. More ambitious NDCs from the countries, specific targets for 2030, a commitment to deliver the 100 billion, building in nature-based solutions, and increasingly channeling funds, regretfully, to adaptation and resilience. Mitigation alone, unfortunately, as we've already seen this year again with climate disasters all over the world, is not enough anymore. So it's a tall order. The good thing is that President Biden last week in the US has now committed 11 billion from the US towards the climate fund. That's a good step forward. We've seen Xi Jinping from China making commitments to not finance any more coal plants being built abroad. That's a good step being forward. We now have 60% of the countries making commitments to be net zero by 2060. That's a good signal, or 2050. That's a good signal. So now I think we need to rally together and make these courageous commitments at a higher level, and the world is waiting for it. I think anything less coming out of Glasgow will have a lot more people in the streets, a lot more businesses dissatisfied, and a lot more governments under pressure. So let's act and let's be responsible. We cannot live in a world, to be honest, where we see the children act like adults and the adults act like children. It's really time to step up to the plate. And we know, by the way, that 90% of the solutions that we need between now and 2030 are already available and are profitable. Just stopping the PERFA subsidies, implementing what we know works, could get us a long way, not least on transferring our energy systems, but also restoring and repairing our biodiversity, the way we produce food, things that we now realize are a crucial part of finding the solutions.
Dr. Podding, we've been talking about how it is all about vaccine access. What do you think we need to do differently to prevent this type of situation occurring again in the future? And in the case of BioNTech, is it gearing up vaccines for other variants of COVID or for other viruses generally?
So I think we come back to the local access, so in local production. So I think you need local production. We learned this from this pandemic. Yeah, as I said before, the distribution is where it's produced. We learned this. There's a correlation. For whatever reason, I mean, this is a new technology, but I think the world learned this time. So I think we have to be prepared for next time that you have a broad production that's probably potentially even kept warm for the pandemic case, because I mean you never need several billion of doses of other vaccines, but in a pandemic, but you need the capacity and you need to keep this warm, and that's something where you probably have to have a network, a global network of like vaccine facilities that has to be kept warm. Ideally, you fill it with, in the case of mRNA, with vaccines that are useful and needed. I mean, we as BioNTech, we just announced that we are working on malaria. That doesn't mean that this would be successful, but we have ideas and we are working on this. So this could be something, if successful, that could run in these facilities to keep it warm. When it comes to the variants, I think that this is the good news about mRNA technology. Within 100 days, you can actually adapt an mRNA vaccine to the variants and then start producing it with the same process. So once you have this up and running and taught the process and tech transferred the process, then you can actually deal with hopefully many mRNA therapeutics or vaccines, and also variants that come along.
Gabriella, a question for you from Laura Segura. And she says, how can we provide support from a trade perspective, not only for developing countries, but to different demographic groups that have been affected differently by the pandemic? For example, kids and women.
So yes, women have been disproportionately affected, and so have people from marginalized racial and ethnic groups. And what we need to do is have rules that take into consideration these disadvantages that are historical and that allow for the active participation in trade of all actors. So it's reducing barriers, as has been said, to make sure that there is participation, especially of those least developed countries, and within them, women and marginalized groups. And within that, again, I go at the moment, that first barrier is the issue of lack of vaccines, and we have less than 3% of the population in those least developed countries have had access, and within that, often most marginalized and women are excluded as well. So there's an important imperative for that vaccine access, and the importance of really working together through WTO, WHO, and companies coming into the mechanisms that have been created in these multilateral systems, rather than doing industry-led approaches on their own.
Paul, earlier we heard from Dr. Ngozi talking about how the WTO has to meet the needs of the 21st century. You've said before that global governance was designed many decades ago. The world has moved on, issues have changed, but international institutions have not adapted. How confident are you that businesses can drive the urgent changes needed? Do you get a sense there is a common purpose when you speak to CEOs of companies now? Paul, you're on mute.
The global institutions that we currently rely on, many have been created during the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, when actually 85% of the world economy was located in the Europe and the US. And organizations like the IMF, the OECD, the World Council, the WTO were very much designed around that. As businesses over the last 60, 80 years have probably updated their strategies and their business models 5 or 10 times to stay alive. Unfortunately, that has not helped with the multilateral institutions. So they're frankly not designed for today's world. Add to that the pressures that politicians are under, because we're not addressing these burning issues of inequality and climate change, increasingly dissatisfaction expressed in the polls, polarizations of people in the countries. It is clear that the political environment has become very difficult. Our argument is very simple, that business cannot succeed in societies that fail, nor do I believe that business can be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place. As the private sector has benefited from good governance over the past decades and been able to globalize themselves to help build this economic progress, it now needs to also step in to help de-risk the political process. And that's a very important thing. In fact, trust in business is now higher than in governments, although it's still at a low level. But the majority of people everywhere in the world expect businesses to step up, to advocate, to participate in the changes that are needed. So bringing enough businesses together, which I try to do in the food sector, in the fashion sector, in the travel and tourist, where you bring the responsible businesses together to call for and showcase the more responsible, inclusive, sustainable business models, hopefully helps governments to get more courage and put the right frameworks and policies in place themselves. So indeed, we will not get there if business doesn't step up, but ultimately we will not achieve the objectives as laid down in the very famous Sustainable Development Goals if we don't get governments ultimately to translate that into the right frameworks, rules, and regulations, if you want to ensure that everybody lives up to these higher standards.
Business needs to step up. Gabriella, what would you like to see big companies which have profited from the pandemic do? What would you like to see from them?
Well, I think the first responsibility of business to give back to society, and as Paul Polman was saying, business cannot thrive in society that is not thriving. The first responsibility is to contribute by paying taxes and also by making sure that they are adequately pricing their products so that they are accessible to all. And when it's a public good, then the responsibilities are different. And I think in this particular case that we've been working and talking about today on vaccine production, so there was 100 billion that was invested from taxpayers from across the world, or several countries that invested on the risk of producing these new vaccines. So we socialize the risk by contributing from governments which were based on taxpayers' money, and then we privatize the profit. And this is what cannot happen. We need to understand the responsibility of business for transforming society and giving back.
There's just time for one final question. Dr. Poding, this one is for you. It's from Pia Estilla. Notwithstanding the necessity of fair access to vaccine, does the waiver provide for provisions for protection of the original producers? Is this the major factor?
Now, I think the main factor is really speed. So I'm really, so as BioNTech together with Pfizer as our partner, we set out to do something to conquer or to produce or develop a vaccine that works and then ramp up the capacity as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So we are really coming from the end, like what needs to be done. And so the number one was develop this, number two was produce, number three was ramp up as much as possible so that there is as much of our vaccine that is successful or efficacious, actually bring this into the market. Number four is enable local access as quickly as possible that is working. So we really come from the end. So we want a local production, and that's we had this topic of trust before. I mean, we are embarking on this journey, and we are trying to get local access done as quickly as possible. So that's where we are coming from, and that's why we chose the way we are working with the countries, with the companies in the various countries, South Africa, Senegal, Rwanda, Latin America, Europharma, BioVac as the partners. That's where we're coming from, to get it as quickly as possible. And I think as a company, we showed that we can work swiftly and quickly, and that's what we're aiming at. That's the pure goal. And in that sense, trust us, we'll get the local mRNA manufacturing going.
We would like to trust you, Dr. Poding. On that note, before we wrap it up, though, we were told that not everyone watching was able to hear the introductory video well. If that's the case, the video is now available on the WTO's YouTube page, and soon it'll be on the WTO website as well. On that note, Gabriela Busha, Dr. Sek Poding, Paul Polman, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.